My recorder's now going. We were talking about Manifest Destiny and the push westward. In American history, from Monroe in the 30s onward, and the annexation, if you will, or the accession of different territories and the push west. And we were, on the right with Leutz's work sort of epitomizing that idea, and Bingham, established in St. Louis, Missouri, showing these boatmen moving up the Mississippi or the Missouri, which were the primary form of transportation at the time. Somewhat nostalgic, however, in that they're being replaced by steamboat travel. But still, the waterways, right, as you might know from your history classes, are an important part of the westward expansion. Is this look for a Northwest Territory or Northwest Passage, right? Some way to get from the east to the north by water. And the idea of exploring the Mississippi as far as the Missouri then up into Yellowstone, was the hopes that that would lead us that way, right? But certainly helped to expand toward those territories through the middle of the 19th century, right? So when we look at the Jolly Flatboatmen, we can also think about them as a symbol of westward expansion, of the importance of waterways, water transportation, as part of westward expansion. Now, it's not the only way, but it played an important role, right? Because we're starting to get the Transcontinental Railroad is being established within a few decades of this, right? The push westward is really landlocked as much as anything. We're going to look briefly at some pictures by George Catlin. Really terrific. I think these are wonderful, wonderful pictures. He's mostly self-taught, and there is a certain naivete to his painting style. But at the same time, there's an amazing sense, like all American art, amazing sense of precise observation, of the importance of details to the work, a sort of, and we've talked about this, an American honesty in its realism. And Catlin also set up shop in St. Louis just as Bingham did, right? And he uses the Mississippi and the Missouri to travel as far west as he possibly can. So again, it's a nice segue from Bingham. And he's traveling west with one idea in mind. He wants to preserve Indian customs. In his words, rescue the noble races of the red men. That's a horrible way of saying it, but that's what he said, right? To rescue these noble races by preserving likenesses and customs of the different tribes he encounters by traveling upriver. Right? Remember that there was the Indian Removal Act in 1830, right? And so for many people, with the idea of removing the Indians from their native lands, putting them on reservations, there was the idea that customs were going to die, times were going to change. And Catlin takes it upon himself to investigate this and hopefully to preserve it for future generations to see. So in 1830, he takes his first steamboat trip. Remember, not flatboats. Those are being replaced, right? His first steamboat trip up the river, up north and west. He actually went along with William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame, right, on a trip upriver. Clark has been dispatched on a specific diplomatic trip into Native American territory, and Catlin will eventually take 4 more trips upriver, each time sketchbook in hand, to paint, to assemble the paintings back in St. Louis, right? So here, White Cloud, the chief of the Iowa tribe. He studied over 50 different tribes on these 5 different trips upriver into native territory. And in these studies, he documents them with great precision, right down to the change in the thickness of the paint on the hands that have drawn the stripes on White Cloud's face, right? It really is sort of marvelously observed as a work. And again, this is all inspired by the Indian Removal Act of 1830. By the end of his career, documenting, and this is all he really did, right? Were these images documenting the what he perceived to be the vanishing races of these tribes. Over 600 paintings by George Catlin are in the Smithsonian American Museum alone. Now, they're not all out, right? Most museums have only about 20% of their paintings on the wall at any given time. But the Smithsonian American Museum has 600 or more different paintings by Catlin. This is how prolific he was. The National Gallery has 300 more. So here in D.C., there in D.C., there are roughly 1,000 pictures by Catlin that we could look at, right? And this is the breadth of his project, right? The importance of this to him, to do this again and again. And he eventually moves back east, and that's where these are mostly painted. He makes the trips in the 1830s, early 1830s, and by 1838 he is back in New York, right? After having used St. Louis as a base. And a great majority of these pictures are painted from sketches he had begun out west and then completed after moving east. And they're marketed to people out east as well who are of a similar mindset, right? And who are interested in the exotic customs and peoples that are to be encountered out west, but at the same time are also interested in them as documents of a lost custom, right? Now, other artists were also back east doing portraits of natives. Many of the natives were coming to the east in order to be to engage in negotiations with the government. You might remember Charles Bird King. He did that artist, the Poor Artist's Cupboard, that really funny little still life picture in the alcove, right, with all of his debts, right, and books about the charms of being poor and all of this. But he was also doing portraits of natives who had come to his studio, which was in Northwest D.C., as they came to Washington to negotiate with the government as part of this ongoing change in their society that our government was foisting upon them. The one in the middle, you'll notice, is wearing a medal around his neck, a European-style medal around his neck. This is the Presidential Peace Medal that was given to him as part of the negotiations. And whenever tribal leaders would receive one of these, they seem to wear them with great pride. And we find them quite often in portraits by Catlin and others, wearing them alongside their own tribal jewelry, their own tribal beads and whatnot. Some of his pictures are also full figure. Here we see a portrait of Catlin, sorry about the typo, working in a studio that he had set up out east, but this is somewhat of a fiction because by this point he had already moved back east, right? So here he is purportedly out west, dressed in native gear, with some of his models appearing with him in this portrait by Fisk. And on the right, we see forebears having come now to pose for him. Many of the paintings were begun, like I said, on site out west, and then eventually completed back east. And Catlin, in addition to painting them, made notes, had a notebook full of annotations about each of them. And he talked about forebears, and he said that he was like a tragic actor coming out onto the stage. He said, no tragic actor ever trod the stage, nor gladiator ever entered the Roman forum with more grace and more dignity than forebears. Right? So he's really trying to document the greatness of these figures. With these hundreds, almost thousands of images by Catlin, We can see with some of them how he worked. He would, when the native chief or warrior would come to sit for his portrait, he would simply sketch out the basic outline and then would spend the majority of his time focusing on the face, because that's the part he can't recreate from memory, right? So in this case, he focuses on the painted decorations of the buffalo on his chest and across his mouth, right? The likeness of the features beneath those makeup decorations, the Presidential Peace Medal, which he sort of roughs out. And then down below, everything is simply sketched in, where the parts that he actually has paid attention to are the parts that he can't recreate after this guy leaves, which is the beaded decorations down the front of his trousers, right? And again, everything sort of from the torso upward. This is typical of his works. Yeah, Tom.
The foreground one's supposed to be 1833?
It is. I'm sorry. The date on that, thank you. 1832 is the date on that. Yeah. But on the final, it's only be 1830s, so you're good. You're good to go, right? When he returned east, he opened up something called the Indian Gallery, with paintings and artifacts from the different tribes he had studied, all these hundreds of paintings. This image on the left shows an Indian who had come for negotiations to Washington, on the left moving toward, as you can see, D.C. buildings in the background. And what happened from that contact, where he trades the peace pipe in for a cigarette and a lady's parasol, and his feathered crown in for a white man's top hat, right? Again, Catlin is sort of cashing in on all of this. When he opened his Indian Gallery, he assembled as many of these pictures as he could in a single gallery to charge admission so people could come in and see. And in the Renwick, the first year I was here, the Renwick had a lot of them together in a single room in a mock-up of how Catlin originally displayed these, right? So they were European gallery style, one atop the other. And as you can see, there are portraits, but there are also images of native life as well, arranged in a massive display in his Indian Gallery, certainly cashing in on the overall interest in a vanishing way of life that our government was bringing about with the Indian Removal Act. And as I just mentioned, he also studied Indian cultures, Indian customs, and here the hunt, right? To braves under wolf skins, sneaking up on the buffalo, right? Very different than your picture, right, Thomas? It's not sort of storming in, but sneaking up, but still with that idea of the lost sea of buffalo. Now, yours is 55 years later, right? And as such, of course, the buffalo population had dwindled from tens of thousands to hundreds, right? Even by that point. And so works like this might well have had an impact on that, on remembering what it had originally been like, and only add more poignancy to what Catlin was up to, right? Which was this vanishing custom, this vanishing way of life. He mentioned in his notebooks that he was actually allowed to accompany them on the hunt, like given his own animal skin to wear as he crawled alongside them. So you could see how it played out, how they held their bows, what did they do as they hunted the buffalo. He was also witness to various sporting spectacles. In fact, the Choctaw Indian invented lacrosse. That's where lacrosse comes from. And here we see their ball play, which is this rudimentary form of lacrosse. And Catlin became a huge fan. As soon as he saw this, he just loved watching these. And numerous pictures of the Choctaw playing ball at various points of, and then documenting sort of how the game works, right? And I don't know anything about lacrosse. But I do know that with Catlin's images, there's quite a few different images of the game, suggesting that what he's trying to document is how the rules play out, right? What happens during the course of one of these games. And when he wrote about it with the same sort of words he used for some of his actors, which is he made these grand comparisons to great moments in history, and he said that the Choctaw Ball game was on a par with ancient Greek Olympics, right? That this was a modern form of athleticism that had a sort of similar grandeur uh, as the ancient Greeks themselves. He began to tour his Indian gallery up and down the East Coast. Uh, and as part of this, as he's bringing his pictures to the various towns and marketing this, one of the things that he started to do were these Wild West shows, kind of like Buffalo Bill, right? Wild West shows where they could experience and actually see for themselves the sorts of customs that he had documented, right? And some of them he would have Indian actors that went with him, but some of them he would dress up Caucasians in Indian costumes so that they could go out and act out these different customs that they could see frozen in his pictures. And so here is right his nephew dressed up in this part of his collection of Native American costumes and with makeup on his hair to make him look as if, to an unskilled eye, as if he were a Native American, but of course he still has very much European features, unlike Catlin's other portraits. Um, he would give lectures, Catlin would. He would use these notes he had taken to sort of deliver these wonderful lectures with pictures around him. I guess like an art history class, right? Talk about his pictures and talk about how they reflected the things that he had seen. They were hugely popular as they traveled around the East. People would often doubt these things that he had seen because, how could they be these fantastic places that they had gone? And one of the things that Catlin would do was whenever he was in a city, if he found out that there were any Native American chiefs on hand to negotiate with the government in various towns, he would invite them to the show. And he was up on stage, he would interview them. Is this accurate? They would say, yes. This is exactly how things happened. And that would add to this idea of this experience, right? It's like, I guess it's kind of like going to the rodeo almost, right? Where you're immersed now in an experience that you don't normally get to experience based on frontier life, only from the native point of view. Eventually, he took the show to London, right? Already by 1839, he's taking his Wild West show, his Indian gallery, and all of the accoutrements that go with it to London. He takes 8 tons of material with him to display in London as part of this Wild West extravaganza, right? Well in advance of Buffalo Bill. Right? It's hugely popular there as well. He has live Indians from the Iowa tribe. He has 2 live grizzly bears that he takes to London with him, right? All as part of this show. So it really is this amazing extravaganza, right? And on a certain level, it's you can look back at Catlin as being this person who's interested, as he says, he's interested in preserving lost customs and ways. But on the other hand, he's a showman, capitalizing, right, on the fact that this is vanishing. From London, he goes to Brussels, right? The show goes on the road throughout Europe. And then eventually in 1845, he winds up in Paris, right, with the Wild West show. And he actually gets the entire Indian gallery installed in the Louvre in Paris as a temporary exhibition. From the Louvre, he's invited, to submit his works to the annual or biennial Salon. Now, some people in class know what the Salon was, but the Salon was every other year, the Royal Academy in France, dating back to the early 18th century, had mounted shows of spectacular works by new talent and old. Hundreds of paintings hung temporarily with tickets and hubbub, where people could see the best art being produced. And in an era before mass media, in an era before electronics, this was the thing to do, right? People would crowd to see them because everyone was excited to see the next new thing. And Catlin is invited from the Louvre show to actually submit his works to the Salon of 1846. Right? And this is a fairly monumental moment in French art history, 1846 is. Catlin, so Lone Wolf, Little Wolf on the right, is one of the works that goes into the Salon of 1846, and Buffalo Bull's Back Fat on the left also goes into that same show, right? These are both being now seen in Paris alongside mostly French players. But what's fascinating about these being in that particular exhibition is that they're images that aggrandize the people of the contemporary world and customs of the modern world, if you will, right? The modern world of these particular tribes, right? And they're documenting what's happening in that world at that time in an unflinching and realistic way, right? No attempts to use allegory to enhance the meaning of the piece. And this comes at a time in France where very few artists were doing that. Were looking at the world around them. Most artists, when they wanted to address contemporary themes, contemporary ideas, used allegory, used history. Right? Would do a painting from ancient Roman history, and you should look at that and understand how the modern world worked. What were some of the issues that were important in today by looking back at what happened in ancient Rome? And that was the norm. Catlin's doing something totally different from that. And what's absolutely fascinating about 1846 is that in 1846, there was a review of the show by Charles Baudelaire, a very famous critic, poet, novelist. And Baudelaire is like a 90, this is how important these shows were, right? The review was like 120 pages long, right? Going through the different artists who were there. He loved Catlin. He just adored him. He thought this is the greatest thing in the world, right? This is the sort of thing French artists ought to be doing too. And he saw a few French artists who were beginning to also do scenes of modern life, scenes of the contemporary world. Baudelaire writes this review, and the review gets published as a book. And the book tells French artists that it's time that they started painting the world around them and stop painting Roman history. And he said, the thing is that when people look back at 19th century France, Baudelaire said in the review of the Salon of 1846, he said, if people look back at 19th century France, and they look at our pictures, because that's what we've got as visual testimony to what happened here, they're not going to see anything. They're going to see ancient Rome. They're not going to know anything about what it was like to be in France and what was great about modern life. And it became a rallying cry for artists in France to paint the world around them realistically. Catlin's part of that. And that review by Baudelaire of the show that Catlin was in is the review that spawns Impressionism, really. Because what's different about Impressionist art, in addition to the technique, is it's the world around you. That's all it is, right? People on boats, people by the river, right? People hanging out in contemporary French society. That comes out of Baudelaire in 1846. And we could argue that indirectly Catlin had a little hand in that. Because his paintings of modern civilization, contemporary civilization of the different tribes helped impress Baudelaire and helped inspire him to ask French artists to do the same. Well, this is all part of our discussion of the way west, right? We're talking about pushing westward with before the break, right before the exam, with Bingham, right? We're really moving our way deeper and deeper into the Western territory, and that's going to push us to talk about artists who really focus on these Western environments. And these are such fantastic pictures, right? Albert Bierstadt is a German immigrant who documents the West. And he goes there firsthand on expeditions that are going out into these newer territories to survey them geologically, geographically, and present that evidence back to Congress in D.C. Right? So Catlin, Bingham, they're part of this westward expansion. The ultimate of this are painters like Bierstadt. They're looking for transportation routes. They're looking for places that are good to settle. And there are survey teams being sent forth to different territories in the far west as America gains these together. And in particular for Bierstadt, in 1859, there was a team that went west headed by Frederick Lander. And they're going into the Rockies to look for a way to get through, right? To push your way all the way to the West Coast. That's part of Manifest Destiny. So Lander's leading this survey team, and they're going to be sort of documenting what is the land like, what is the foliage like, what are the people like, what are the animals like, and Lander's expedition team, right, has a staff photographer. Photography is only recently developed. By 59, it's only about 20 years old. But cameras had become more or less portable, still kind of clunky, right? And they hired Bierstadt to come along and make sketches, right? So he goes in 1859 all the way into the Rockies for the very first time. Now this painting's 10 years later and based on the second trip, right? But in 1859, he goes with Lander making sketches. Now his sketches are both pencil sketches, but they are also oil sketches, right? Works on paperboard, right? And these will then come back with him, and both the photos and the sketches become part of the report that's given to Congress, right? The official government survey of the Western Territories. But for Bierstadt, the sketches also fulfill a second function in that he uses them when he gets back east to make these monumental pictures. Now that landscape on the right is 10 feet across. It is huge. It's twice the size that it is here on the screen. Right? It's roughly a little bit less than the size of our entire screen here. Right? It's a huge picture. And it's based on these sketches he's made, but it's based on them in a composite manner. In other words, you can't find that location. But no one back east knew this. Right? No one who saw the picture had any idea. Only Bierstadt himself knew that this is not an actual location. It looks like it. It looks so photographic, right? It looks documentary, as if we could look at it right here, right now. But what it is the waterfall in the middle is one view, and you can find that. The massive waterfall on the left is another view, and you might be able to find that. And the mountains in the background are identifiable. But do you see them all from one vantage point? No. He's cobbled together the best of 3 or 4 different views, sometimes 5 or 6 different views, in order to give you this one picture that has everything in it. Right? Perfect view. And he would then show these to people back east. Right? So Bierstadt himself, this is the only thing I could find online. He also had a camera. Bierstadt had his own camera. So in addition to the official photographer for the survey team, Bierstadt is taking photos himself. And I don't know the extent to which these were landscape versus figural photos. Like I said, that's the only one I could find online anywhere, actually by him. But these also play a role in composing his different pictures, right? So his sketches, his photographs were all brought together to compose these monster pictures back east. This one's in the Met in New York, a peak that was named after Frederick Lander. Native life in the foreground based on his photographs, most certainly. Notice the similarity in how he lays things out. He loves these vistas where it gets sort of dark on the edges, right? And you get these sort of, soft frames around the sides, right, that are darker. And then you see through that to a more brightly lit center. And as we move further back, you find this sort of dramatic spotlighting on certain elements in the composition that becomes sort of razor sharp and crystal clear, like the waterfall in the background of each of the two of these, or the lighting on the mountains in the back. It's theatrical, right? It's like looking through a tunnel at the view on the far side, right? It's really spectacular that way, and they're very, very dramatic, and they were hugely successful, right? People just loved these things for that overwhelming drama. And even though they look precise and realistic, again, remember that none of these views you could ever find, right? They are all cobbled together from different sketches of different things. And it's a greatest hits record, right? You don't have to listen to those crappy side B tracks, I'm a punk. The third record in Sandinista by The Clash is really horrible. But you go get the greatest hits record and you get all the really good stuff on the side A, right, of the first record. You don't have to listen to the fluff, the stuff that are just knockoffs. You get the greatest hits, and that's what these are. These are greatest hits records of his experience out west, right? So he's creating, in a way, a inaccurate and very romantic idea of what the West is all about, right? Everything out west is chock-a-block full of fantastic geography, right? Like there are no letdowns out there, right? Everything is formidable and fantastic, right? All of this mythology of this amazing West, this theater waiting for us as we move. All of this is helping to create interest out east to move west. I mean, we've acquired the territories, right? But nobody's living there yet. Or not nobody, but not enough. And we need them to be populated so that these can now be added as states to the Union. And Bierstadt's pictures, while they're not intentional, they're not government-sponsored this way, they play a role in helping to inspire people living crowded East Coast cities. Why not move out here, right? Where life is grand and amazing, where every morning you could wake up and see the clouds break over the hills and watch the mist and listen to the waterfalls. Right? So things I've been, my American history stinks, but look this up, right? So the Louisiana Purchase in the center, right? 1803 was this huge annexation of land that we purchased from France that began to push us west and got us into Wyoming, got us into Montana, right? Got us into Colorado down below it as well, right? And then after that, we get the Oregon country, right? And then from the Mexican cession, remember the Mexican War from the Caton picture that we saw, right? Those were added in the mid-40s. And these all now become part of the American territories during the time of the 40s as this great expansion west. Right? So Bierstadt moving out there as part of the survey team in 1859 is sort of now, what did we get? What's out there as part of this land that we have been able to pick up from various purchases, annexations, and whatnot, right? And of course, in order for these to be translated into statehood, they need population, right? And this is why there's a huge lapse between when the states were purchased and when they were actually annexed as states or founded as states. And so out west, the first ones to become states were Oregon and California, right? 1850, 1859. California 1850 and Oregon 1859, right? But they're much later in adding because they're simply not populated, right? So Bierstadt's pictures are right in the midst of all of this, right? this not only accessing the land in the first place, gaining it, but also populating it to the point where we can push towards statehood. Right? Arizona, I didn't know this, didn't become a state until 1917. Right? That's how slow it was from the actual gaining of the land to its final official recognition as part of the United States. Right? So Bierstadt's pictures are right in the middle of all of this, right? It coincides with this growing statehood and interest in the West. And Bierstadt lived long enough to see all of these states become states. Everything except for New Mexico and Arizona, right, became states during Bierstadt's lifetime. Right? Now, our picture, right, like I said, sketches he made. His second great trip out west, his first one to California, 1863. He goes to California, begins to make sketches. And looking incredibly closely. And these are just, I mean, a wonderful sense of three-dimensionality, right? But the painting was actually made in London. In 1863, he goes to California, again as part of a survey team. In 1867, he gets married. And he goes to Europe on a honeymoon with his wife, and he stays for 3 years or so, right? And so he's in London with the sketches, with the wife, and he wants to stay on, extend the honeymoon, and he decides to continue to make these amazingly large pictures and display them to the public, right? And he would charge entry fees, and this way he could make money to continue to stay in Europe. Not a bad idea, right? And his wife is all fine with this, and he would actually sell tickets to these pictures and unveil them with great drama. This is really kind of a cool story about Bierstadt. He would drop little news stories in the press about when he was going to unveil a new picture, right? And they would print them. And he would unveil them in his studio. And what he had was a room that was darkened. That seemed to sort of extend the darkness that's at the edge of these pictures would come out around you, you know, and you'd be in this darkened room with the spotlights on the wall. And there was a curtain, right? And it was in an alcove. So this dark alcove curtain. And it's sort of like, this is exactly how they have it at the Smithsonian American Museum. It's very much like this, right? And he would get up, and then people would be looking at it, and then he would sort of dramatically part the curtains and look at it. And then he did this wonderful thing where he gave people these little, like, opera glasses, right? They were basically little telescope tubes that you would look through at his pictures. And what they did was they made it so that you couldn't see the entire picture. You could just see the bit in the middle. And you could do this with your hands, right? And as people would look at the picture through the tubes, it made it that much more three-dimensional because of the way that light bends when it hits sharp corners, right? This is why you see better when you squint, right? You see more sharply when you squint. So if you just took your fingers and so you made your little triangle with your fingers and looked through it at the picture, do that for a second. Let's take a picture of it. Especially the one on the right, right? And start just moving around the picture and see what happens there. And see how realistic that ends up looking? Now imagine it is twice as big, right? Twice as wide as this. And you can stand closer and just do this. And all of a sudden you're there, right? You are totally immersed in this environment. And they have the sense of actually being there. Right? So they were this drama that he's using and showmanship. To exhibit his pictures to the people, right? Sold tickets, right? Eventually, this picture among the Sierra Nevada traveled throughout all of Europe, all the way to St. Petersburg, right? And people mentioned that it inspired them to actually come to America in the first place, right? And then eventually, when he got done with his honeymoon, he was able to bring it back home. I can't imagine a 10-foot painting making its way across but it was easier when you were on a boat than a plane to do that sort of thing, right? Now, this experience that he's giving us, right, with this sort of almost 3D experience of looking through these tubes at the pictures in this darkened room, right, with the spotlighting, is probably indebted to the work that his brothers were doing. Both of his brothers, uh, Edward and Charles, were involved in stereoscopic photographs. You know about these? They're pretty cool. We have a whole set of these. My parents do, back in Oregon. These are on a card about this big, right? And they're taken with a camera with two apertures, right? So on a piece of film, you get two different images, and the apertures are as far apart as the average human eye. Okay? So each one is looking at the screen at the same scene from a slightly different angle. Okay? And they end up on a card, and there was a little handheld viewer that was developed in the 1850s that you would put the card in, and the viewer had two little lenses here. And you got it to just the right thing, and it replicated three-dimensionality. So the figures in the foreground floated in front of the thing behind it, right? They're really cool. You might be able to, at the Smithsonian American, you might be able to actually do one of these, right? They're great. And his brothers are now labeled for us, are deeply involved in this, and in fact, Albert is investing in it as well. But they're doing the same sort of thing that his paintings are doing, right? They're doing this idea of immersing yourself through a sort of optical viewing device, immersing yourself in this landscape that's chosen for its the height of drama, right? Landscape being presented to you and allowing you to drop away the world around you, because it's some primitive VR, right? Primitive virtual reality, as if you're already there. And for Bierstadt, right, not only is there this personal thing of these stereoscopic photos that his brothers do, but there's also this interest in photography in general. He's taking pictures himself, right? And photography is, in the 1850s, really blossoming for the first time, right? Spreading more widely. And people are getting away from the earliest photographs, which were on tin, right? Daguerreotypes. The earliest photographs were on pieces of metal that had been chemically treated so that when the light hit them, the metal oxidized, right? And they figured out a process to print photos on paper, right? And that only happens in the 1850s. And those are the sorts of photos that Bierstadt's taking. Okay? These, when they go on display, there are accounts of how people viewed them. Even non-stereo photographs. People viewed them with magnifying glasses. And there was the belief that photographs could record more information than your eye could actually see if you were there. The camera sees more than you do. And on a certain level, that's true, in that we don't perceive detail as well, right? Whereas the camera can. Now, a bit about photography. You may or may not know this, right? Earliest cameras had a very, very small aperture. The aperture is how wide it opens. Right? Modern cameras, except your cell phone, but real cameras, you can change how wide the aperture opens. What's called the f-stop. Right? And the light that hits the photosensitive paper, right, has to be a certain amount of light, otherwise it overexposes. And if it's not enough, it underexposes. So it can be all black if you don't get enough light, all white if you get too much. And how you regulate the light that hits that paper these days is a combination of how long the shutter's open, right, and how wide it opens. So to get the same amount of light, you can go like this, wide, or like this, small. That make sense? Either way, you get this. Think about a garden hose versus a fireman's hose. How long would you have to run the water in a garden hose to get the same amount of water you would get through a fireman's hose? Right? That's how that works. Now, earliest cameras had a single aperture setting. Very, very small. And that meant that the exposure was very, very low. Right? So most of the portraits that you see of people that were in photographs at this time, they've got a little brace that they're wearing in the back of their neck to keep their head really still. This is why they're always looking like this. Right? It's because they can't move. because the aperture, the exposure is like 30 seconds, right? And why you often see things that get blurry when they're trying, and action photos are possible, right? All the Civil War photos from the 1860s, all of them are dead people. They don't move, right? So our waterfall is so fuzzy looking because you can't freeze it, right? Because of the aperture. Now, the reason I go into this is that one of the things, this is basic camera 101, right? A small aperture records more detail. With a small aperture, you have what's called depth of field. That means if I sat here with a camera and took a picture of this class, right, and I had a really small, like pinhole aperture, everything would be in focus from Elton's knees to the whiteboard in the back, right? Whereas if I have a wider aperture, I have no depth of field, it flattens out. And I would either get your face, and Thomas would be blurry behind it, or I could get Thomas's face, and you would be blurry in front of it, right? So the cameras and the kinds of pictures that they're taking at the time are, one, slow exposures, and two, have that amazing depth of field, where every single rock working back into the distance is equally in focus, right? All the way to the deepest recess, if it's not moving, to the closest thing to you. And that is exactly how Bierstadt paints. Everything is in crystal sharp focus, whether it's the ripples of the waves with the ducks in the foreground, or the glistening water as it falls in the background. And he does it one better, right? Because he can, as a painter, freeze the water. Something that a photograph simply couldn't do. And he can present it huge, where you don't necessarily need a magnifying glass to look at it, which is how people review the photos. So these are photo challenges, if you will, right? They're challenging what photos could do, and in a way indebted to that, because the work, in fact, shows us, invites us to engage with it in a way that people engage with photographs. And everything is just so incredibly painted, right? They're just so wonderful in his capture. And even more so if you keep in mind that he is nowhere near this when he paints it. He's in London. He's in freaking London with sketches he made on site. And he captures the refraction of those rocks as they go down into the water, right? The light of the water as it laps against the edge of the rock, the reflections, in addition to being able to see through the water, it's just, it looks photographic, even though it's painted. It's just phenomenal this way. More so considering how he's painting, right? He loves putting wildlife or something in the foreground that helps to sort of lock in the space in that sort of three-dimensional fashion, something you would look past so that you get a sense of foreground versus background. And these, again, these reflections that come down, and even the water as it dances around the hooves and the muzzle of the deer that are actually in the water. Still, we can see where the craquelure violates that, right? But at the time, you wouldn't even have seen that. It's wonderful detail of the ducks taking off from the water, and even a little fleck of the water here where the duck has just left the water for the air. But again, capturing these different optical effects is really one of his incredible strong points, right? That's all based on these wonderful photographs that he's been immersed in, both taking them as single photographs, but those stereo photographs that his brothers were taking. And again, opening up to these lit vistas in the deepest background, where, as you can see, everything from the deer in the foreground to the topmost part of that waterfall are equally sharply focused, even if we lose it in the atmosphere, right? We're not losing it because of depth of field. Again, he's cobbling together these scenes, right, of the most amazing views he could possibly find, and bringing them together into one work. And nobody in London would know one way or the other whether or not this could possibly be. Right? He would use some of the photographs to prove it. Right? He had those that he could use, but right, he's making it as dramatic as he absolutely can in this, and it's almost as if there's the light of God falling on all of these. So they're really fantastic, right? These landscapes by Bierstadt, and again, even more so if we take into account their scale. Right? So he's encouraging us to immerse ourselves, encouraging us to find wonder in God's creation. Right? Now, he was the perfect artist to be invited to accompany Lander on that first expedition in 1859. And the reason for this is because he had gained quite a bit of reputation with this picture, which is a picture of the Alps, right? Lake Lucerne in Switzerland, and the Alps behind it. And this was one of his earliest landscapes, is one of his first that went on public display. And the acclaim that it received, it's also 10 feet across the base, okay, helped to establish his career as the painter of mountains, right? And remember that he's German, spent most of his career in America. Amazingly, he's self-taught, which just to me is phenomenal, right? Encouraging too, isn't it? Drop out now. Well, it's not too late, right? Alton's a senior this year in our art program, and imagine learning to do this primarily by yourself. Now, in America, he's mostly self-taught. He goes to Germany, goes back to his parents' homeland of Germany, hoping to study under some German landscape painters, get some formal training, right? So in 1853, Bierstadt goes to Germany. The painter he wants to study under dies, and he winds up actually studying under another German American. He works under Leutze, who's gone back to Germany at that same time. And so it's kind of an irony in a way that he goes to Europe to get some formal training, and he winds up with an American, right, back in Europe. But nonetheless, Leutze sort of helps him refine his style, right, while he's back there. And after receiving this training, he then goes on a number of sketching ventures, some with Leutze, some with other artists. And he seeks out these incredible dramatic vistas that he can find in southern Germany and Switzerland and Austria. Even goes to Italy, the Italian Alps, right, looking for these incredible vistas. And then begins this practice of bringing the different sketches back to the studio and using them to cobble together a view, right? So we know what village this is. This is the village of Brünnen, which you see through the trees, right? Here's a modern photograph. This is where he is, right? And I spent some time looking at this photograph, trying to figure out where he was when he painted this, right? And then you realize that there's no point, because the way he works, right, violates the sense that there's one in place. I mean, we might argue that he's sort of down over here, right, kind of looking over the hills of the village in the background, but he's screwed it around, right, to where you can't see it in the same way, because he's not trying to document it geographically. What he's trying to do is exploit it for its drama and its picturesque qualities. So he takes sketches. We can identify the different Alps in the background. One of them is St. Gothard, the famous St. Gothard Pass. We can identify the city, but you can never find a place where you can stand and see it from this point of view, right? That's not how he works. That's not how he's putting it together, right? It's from a series of sketches. And of course, it's painted back in the studio because you can't set up a 10-foot canvas outside, right? It's just a physical impossibility. Again, you'll notice that the foreground has this darkness, right, that establishes this sort of tunnel view to the brighter background that sort of welcomes us to move past the darkness and into the background. In the foreground, we have other people, our surrogates, if you will, moving on the path that snakes its way between the opening of the trees and toward the town of Brünnen in the background, a caravan with a fire, pack animals. Some of the National Gallery literature says they're gypsies. I don't know why they say that, but nonetheless, other travelers like ourselves, right? And they become our introduction into the picture as we move past the foreground and then deeper and deeper in. There are some of the identifiable mountains where, again, he pales them. This is a normal thing for him to pale the mountains in the background to show God's light on them as the steam rises. And again, everything crystal sharp in its resolution, right, from front to back. Wonderful anecdotal details in the landscape. Again, it's inviting you to wander through with your eyes. Cute little cottage with its flowered fields, raising different flowers for sale, dotting the landscape in front of it. A road that leads across various bridges, a small footbridge in the foreground. We follow it back. We see horses moving through a covered bridge across the river. We see figures in the fields, right? All of these charming details are meant to keep you engaged with the picture and keep your eye moving through it. And these sorts of details that I was able to get close enough to take are the sorts of things that he wanted you to see when you got your little tube out, right? And you would look at them and you would work your way through the landscape, and then you would pick up, a hay cart in the foreground. While on one hand we have people moving through the landscape in the sunlit area between us and the lake, over here on the right we see a church on the top of the hill. And I need to go back and take another picture of this, but right here on the path there are figures moving up the path toward the church. And they're making a religious procession, which is something that we saw in Thomas Cole's work, isn't it? Where we saw figures moving through the landscape as this metaphor for moving through life, with the church as the destination, as the goal at the end of our life. And I think what's fascinating about this for me, somebody who comes from studying Renaissance periods, is that this church on a hill, with figures making a religious procession through the shadows up to the church on the hill, juxtaposed with other figures moving through a flattened landscape, is actually a convention in painting that we can trace back to the Renaissance, to this idea that a landscape picture is more than just a pretty picture, that a landscape picture presents to its viewer a metaphor, an allegory. Life is a pilgrimage. Life is a trip. A movement through time being translated into a movement through space. And that when we look back at Renaissance pictures, where we find landscape being used as this metaphor, we will find the high road and the low road. Christ talks about this, doesn't he? The Bible mentions that there's a high road that's more difficult and better for being more difficult. The low road, which is easier than most people take. Right? The low road leads not to salvation, the high road does. So the church on the hill becomes a strong metaphor for the encouragement to take the more difficult path that leads upward and leads towards salvation. And I think Bierstadt, having studied in Europe, this was painted while he was living in Europe, right? Picks up on these ideas. Well, this is something closer. What is that? Can you see them any better there? Right? The group along the path here, moving up toward that church. Here's one of our earliest pictures that sort of takes landscape and incorporates it into a religious picture, where we see St. Jerome spending time praying in the wilderness to get away from the city. And he's in the center as this sort of fulcrum, right, on the balance between the low road on the left, which leads to a city, like Brünn, and the high road to the right, where the path leads to a church. Right? The same convention is what Bierstadt's using in Lake Lucerne as well. to where he's presenting to us, consciously or not, right? The idea of landscape as not only do you immerse it yourself into it just to have fun, right? To enjoy it as a scene, to escape from the city, but you immerse yourself in it with the idea of reflecting on what it all means, right? Which is really the point of going to the landscape in the first place, is to spend some time reflecting on what it all means. At the same time, there's always this drama, right? There are always these metaphors of, look at that hill, look at that house up on the side of the hill there, where the smoke's coming up, right? And perched precariously, very romantically along the side. And then these metaphors, the steamboat, of progress coming into this virgin landscape. We could read this painting, cut across it 6 or 7 different ways to come up with different meanings for it, right? The pilgrimage meaning, the progress issue, right? The romantic idea of the power of nature. All of these things are elements that Bierstadt includes in this picture. Well, like I said, this was based on his experiences painting in Germany, Switzerland, right, where he had gone to polish off his training. This was the very first work he publicly displayed. Right? He submitted it to the National Academy of Design, and we've talked a lot about the importance of the National Academy of Design, right, as a venue for American artists. He submits it to them in 1858 to be displayed. They accept it, they display it. Huge positive reception. Like the hit of the year was Bierstadt's 10-foot picture of Lake Lucerne, even though it's not an American scene, right? Which is what they were saying people should do. It was so successful that Bierstadt was elected as an honorary member of the National Academy on the spot, based solely on the merits of this picture, right? Got him elected. And that picture also got him selected to join Lander the next year on the Expedition West, which established him as the painter of the American Alps, right? Began as the painter of the European Alps, and that made him the logical selection to be the painter of the Great American West, right? So this was an important picture insofar as his ongoing career is concerned. This is a much smaller picture. It's only about 4 feet across. It's only about like that. And it depicts a scene that he actually said he saw while accompanying Lander in 1859. Right? He described having seen this. And you can see it's still painted 10 years later. He's still using those sketches to reassert his ideas in his later career. And he talks about the encounter with the buffalo, right? And he said that this was his very first time that he'd actually seen buffalo. Right? And they were standing around the expedition team. They're armed. They have to be, right? They're in the wilderness. You don't have to be anymore in the wilderness, but back in the day, right? And he said when he first saw the buffalo, he was frozen with awe. He simply couldn't move. He said he saw them splashing through the water, right? And he said, I felt half inclined to lay down my rifle and take up my sketchbook. But I was so wrapped up in admiration that I froze and I could do neither, right? So he's absolutely amazed at seeing these animals. And this was part of this experience of the West that was hitting people back east, right? Was this encountering of a world they had never seen, and things they hadn't encountered. I don't know with this smaller picture if he's really attempting to do that same sort of immersion in the landscape that he does with those massive pictures, right? You can still see that sort of tunnel vortex leading to a brighter background, shaded on right and left with the trees. And certainly as you get close enough to it, the rocks loom overhead, just not in quite the same way as they do with a 10-foot picture, right? They aren't literally towering overhead, but the same meticulousness of illustration, whether it's the trees, the mountains, equally sharp, the clouds, or the birds lighting in the dead branches, right? Everything is exquisitely rendered. And again, very romantic, right? Very much interested in the power of nature. This storm sweeping over and swallowing the mountains on the right. But I think there's this sense with this picture that it's harmonious. The buffalo aren't running away as the clouds gather, as the lightning probably is starting to strike, based on that cloud that wisps down. I think there certainly is already a downpour. But they're moving away gently. They're in harmony with this. They know that this weather is strong and will pass, but they have what it takes to survive. Whether or not you and I do is an entirely different proposition, right? But it certainly is presented to us with the amazing power of nature untamed out west. Well, we've got some other Bierstadt to look at. We'll move on from there to Thomas Moran. After that, we'll shift gears quite significantly and talk about more down-to-earth scenes by Eakins and Homer, right? So we'll be looking at Bierstadt and Moran on Friday. Okay. Again, remember